Let's begin with our top story. Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi says India's unilateral decision to revoke occupied Kashmir's status is a regional security risk. Addressing a seminar in Islamabad, Qureshi called for peace and a lasting solution of the Kashmir issue. The foreign minister said Pakistan's diplomatic efforts have actively sensitized the world to the Kashmir crisis. He said the UN, Human Rights Watch, the EU, and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation are talking about India's illegal move today. Qureshi said Prime Minister Imran Khan has communicated the gravity of the worsening humanitarian crisis to several heads of states. The foreign minister said, in addition to Muslims, every minority is unsafe in today's Hindutva-ruled India. In occupied Kashmir itself, the month-long lockdown by Indian forces has triggered food shortages. Kashmiris told undercover journalists the crushing curfew has created a medical emergency as well. The valley has now been cut off from the world by a communications blackout for 30 days. Millions of residents in Indian-occupied Kashmir are facing an acute shortage of food, medicine, and medical treatment. Amid reports of violence by Indian troops, Kashmiris living outside the valley fear the worst for their besieged relatives. One Kashmiri youngster shared their ordeal but hid his identity to escape Indian retribution. Indian occupation forces have arrested 11,000 Kashmiri politicians, activists, journalists, and civilians in less than a month. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia's Foreign Minister Adel Al-Jubeir is expected to visit Pakistan this week to discuss the situation in Kashmir. Members of the EU Parliament Foreign Affairs Committee have condemned India's illegal move to revoke occupied Kashmir's special status. In a meeting in Brussels, the members of Parliament called the rights situation in the occupied region a human tragedy. The valley is under a crushing Indian curfew and communications blackout for 30 days. Meanwhile, Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi briefed his counterpart in Iceland, Gulorg Tor, about the situation in the occupied region. Qureshi said Indian actions are against international laws and UN Security Council resolutions. Iceland's foreign minister expressed concern about the human rights violations in occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Let's get to some other news now. Iran has ruled out direct negotiations with the U.S. addressing the country's parliament. President Hassan Rouhani says Tehran will counter U.S. pressure with active diplomacy instead of talks. The president says Tehran's strategy is to hold on to revolutionary patience and rationality. Rouhani said Washington set out to isolate Tehran, but its effective diplomacy is isolating the U.S. over the nuclear deal. Earlier, U.S. President Donald Trump had offered to meet Iranian leaders and to hold bilateral talks with no preconditions. Iran also says it will hold joint military exercises with Russia in the Indian Ocean, but Foreign Minister Javad Zarif did not say when the drills will be held. During his visit to Russia, Zarif said several other countries may join in on the exercises. Iran's foreign minister said these exercises are not aimed at third countries, but to maintain regional security. He said Tehran and Moscow have a similar vision on security in the Persian Gulf. Zarif said the Tehran-Moscow security plan is based on cooperation, where the American idea of security is aggression and hostility. Well, 16 civilians have been killed and over 100 others have been injured in a blast near the Green Village complex in Kabul. The Taliban have claimed responsibility, saying they were targeting foreign forces. The Interior Ministry says the blast was caused by a tractor packed with explosives parked beside a wall of the complex. The Taliban say the attack was coordinated because it was followed by fighters entering the complex to fight Afghan forces. Remaining on topic, U.S. Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzadeh said Washington will withdraw 5,000 troops from Afghanistan. That move will mean the closure of 5 bases and is part of the draft peace treaty with the Taliban. 14,000 U.S. troops are currently stationed in the country. In an interview, Khalilzad said U.S. President Donald Trump will approve the deal before it can be signed. Earlier, Khalilzad shared the draft peace agreement with Afghan President Ashraf Ghani. Ghani's spokesman Siddiq Siddiqui says a ceasefire is part of the deal between the U.S. and the Taliban. He says President Ghani wants the U.S. to share the details of the agreement with all Afghan leaders.
We hope that it will result to a ceasefire, it will result to a direct talks, and finally we could convince the Taliban to abandon violence against the Afghans. And absolutely that will lead us to a settlement.
Meanwhile, the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is headed to Brussels to discuss this proposed Afghan peace deal with the chief of NATO. Well, in other news, the International Criminal Court has ordered its prosecutor to consider reopening the 2010 Gaza flotilla attack case against Israel. That raid killed 10 people, including 9 Turkish citizens on the ship carrying aid to the besieged Gaza Strip. Previously, prosecutor Fatou Bensouda had declined to try Israel over that attack. The court directed Bensouda to reconsider her decision by December. The case was filed in 2013 by the Comoros, the Indian Ocean nation, where the ship was registered. Ties between Israel and Turkey crumbled after that raid, but Israel offered an apology to Ankara and a payout of $20 million to the families of the deceased. Onto the UK now, where Prime Minister Boris Johnson has asked MPs not to vote for a Brexit delay, saying he does not want snap elections. Yet opponents of a no-deal Brexit are preparing to table a binding resolution in Parliament today. Ruling Tory rebels have joined forces with the opposition Labour Party to bring a bill designed to stop a no-deal Brexit. If passed, it will force Johnson to request a delay in Brexit until the end of January. But Prime Minister Johnson says the chances of a new deal being struck with the EU by October 31st are rising. Speaking outside Number 10, Johnson said the UK would leave the EU on schedule, come what may.
I want everybody to know there are no circumstances in which I will ask Brussels to delay. We're leaving on the 31st of October, no ifs or buts. We will not accept any attempt to go back on our promises or scrub that referendum. And armed and fortified with that conviction, I believe we will get a deal.
Well, government could call for an election on October 14th if Parliament passes the Brexit block bill. Now, U.S. Vice President Mike Pence has said Washington wants a Brexit deal which encourages stability in Ireland. Pence says any deal should support the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. U.S. Vice President Pence said America understands the UK's exit from the European Union raises complex issues. He was speaking after arriving on his first official visit to the Republic of Ireland as U.S. Vice President.
We will continue to work closely with our partners in Ireland and the United Kingdom to support a Brexit plan that encourages stability and also one which keeps the strong foundation forged by the Good Friday Agreement. Now, we understand these are complex issues.
All physical borders between the Irish Republic and the British province of Northern Ireland were dismantled as part of that Good Friday Agreement. Over 100 migrants have disembarked in Sicily after Italian police seized a German rescue ship. The vessel's captain, Klaus-Peter Reich, says Mediterranean storms forced him to seek shelter in the port of Pozzallo. The vessel Eleanor waited 8 days to be granted safe harbor by Italian authorities. The Italian Coast Guard allowed the 31 remaining migrants aboard the ship to use another rescue ship to land on the island of Lampedusa. In the meantime, the Spanish Coast Guard has rescued 200 North African migrants attempting a dangerous crossing. Elsewhere, the Libyan Navy also picked up more than 100 migrants off that country's western coast. 25 bodies have been recovered after a scuba diving vessel sank when it was consumed by a fire off an island in Southern California. The U.S. Coast Guard says a search operation is currently underway to look for the 9 other missing passengers. The 75-foot commercial diving boat erupted in flames near the shoreline of Santa Cruz Island. Santa Barbara County Sheriff Bill Brown said 39 people were on board when the fire broke out. 5 of the diving boat's crew members escaped the blaze. Authorities, though, say the cause of the fire is so far unknown.
We understand the tremendous burden that they are under right now as they wait to determine exactly what happened and what condition and situation their loved ones are in. We will be working diligently to try to get them as much information as possible as soon as possible.
Authorities have said the possibility of towing that boat ashore is being considered as well. Let's move on now to Russia, where the Shiveluch volcano in that country's far east has erupted, spewing a column of ash 5.5 kilometers into the sky. Authorities in Kamchatka territory say the ash cloud stretches 83 kilometers southeast of that volcano. Russia's emergencies ministry says ash fallout has not affected the nearby Siberian settlements. Five people have died after Hurricane Dorian has hit the Bahamas. In the meantime, mass evacuations are underway in nearby states on the U.S. East Coast. The International Red Cross says some 13,000 houses have been damaged or destroyed in the Bahamas. The U.S. National Hurricane Center says Dorian has weakened to a Category 3 as it pummeled the island chain with winds of 125 miles per hour. Bahamian officials say the Abacos Islands are underwater after being inundated by storm surges as high as 23 feet. Prime Minister Hubert Minnis says the hurricane is a tragedy for the archipelago.
The Royal Bahamas Police Force has confirmed that there are 5 deaths in Abaco. We are in the midst of a historic tragedy in parts of northern Bahamas. Our mission and focus now is search, rescue, and recovery.
And coming up next in this news bulletin, militants sow death and fear in northern Mozambique. And 1,187 drug-related deaths over the last year. Let's begin this segment in Mexico, where 5 people have been killed after gunmen attacked a bus station in the city of Cuernavaca. Morelos state authorities say the shooting was targeted and part of a turf war between rival drug cartels. Officials say the gunmen killed 3 passengers on a bus, 1 in the waiting area and another in a bathroom. Authorities say Morelos is the epicenter of a turf war between at least 5 narcotics gangs. Over 250,000 people have been killed in drug wars since 2006. The Mexican army has been fighting those cartels for 13 years. Brazil has now reached out to Norway and Germany for help in putting out thousands of wildfires in the Amazon rainforest. The 2 European states last month discontinued financial aid to Brazil over deforestation. Berlin and Oslo suspended funding in protest at the increased destruction of Brazil's rainforests. The move did not go down well with President Jair Bolsonaro. But Environment Minister Ricardo Salles says talks on the resumption of that aid is progressing. The Bolsonaro administration earlier admitted it does not have the resources to put out the fires. Indigenous tribes living deep within the Amazon are faced now with an existential crisis. The choking smoke is also causing breathing disorders among the Amazon's children. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia have laid down their arms in 2016, but its former members are still far from leading healthy and prosperous lives. More on that now in this report.
The 5-decade-long conflict, which claimed the lives of almost 300,000 people, came to an end when the rebels signed a peace deal. That deal was signed in 2016 with former President Juan Manuel Santos. The guerrillas agreed to disarm in return for promises of reintegration into society, economic benefits, and political representation in Congress. But many still fear for their lives and are concerned the present government isn't doing enough for their reintegration into society.
La preocupación más grande es
The greatest concern is for life, to guarantee lives because they're killing people not just in reintegration process but also hundreds of social activists. People fighting for their rights, fighting for their reidentifications, and that is why they're seen as targets. In second place, the implementation of the peace agreement that needs to have a guarantee to life.
y en segundo lugar
Current President Ivan Duque has opposed many aspects of the peace deal and unsuccessfully tried to make amendments via Congress. He has asked for tougher punishments for ex-rebels who committed war crimes. Some 14,000 ex-guerrillas are in the reincorporation process, with a quarter living in 24 reintegration camps. The UN says 137 ex-combatants have been killed since the deal was signed, leaving many afraid for their lives outside the camps. UN figures show just 10% of ex-guerrillas have been granted credit for farming and development projects.
One starts to lose faith in the credibility of the peace process from the state. I have faith in the decisions that were taken at the beginning, the fight for peace, to find a way to build a stable and durable peace.
A dissident movement is another growing concern. A group of former rebels announced a new offensive in late August as a reaction to failures in the peace process. The government says it will extend a monthly $200 stipend to ex-combatants until December 31st. But this could be too little, too late.
The United Nations has condemned rising violence across Nigeria and the lack of accountability for perpetrators. The UN Special Rapporteur Agnes Callamard says Nigeria needs to take urgent action to end the violence. Presenting her findings in Abuja, Callamard said Nigeria is a pressure cooker of internal conflict. She said the country requires changes in its judiciary, police, and military for people to stop resorting to violence. Callamard says Nigeria's failure to address the situation could destabilize other West African countries. Nigeria is currently facing multiple conflicts, including tribal wars and attacks by the terrorist group Boko Haram. Cabo Delgado in the north of Mozambique is one of that country's poorest regions. It is also the site of a little-known insurgency that has been sowing terror for close to 2 years. Watch now how people are leading their lives in fear.
Burnt-out houses, food supplies reduced to ash, and villagers left hungry and fearing for their lives. For nearly 2 years now, the residents of the North Mozambican province of Cabo Delgado have been living in fear of attacks.
They came out of nowhere and burnt my house. Now we live with nothing. We have nothing left. We live like this now.
The attacks are unclaimed, and those who carry them out remain largely unidentified.
I don't know who they were. It was night, but I can tell you that there were a lot of them. They were young people, and women too.
Over 300 people have died in these attacks since October 2017. Many of the survivors have since fled, like Ayuba and his family, to seek refuge with relatives who live elsewhere. 6 people live in this hut, a family wrenched away from the fields that normally provide their livelihood.
I urge the government to do all it can to put a stop to this war, so that we can get back to a normal life.
Local authorities say they are concerned by the situation and are doing all they can to secure the region. But for the Bishop of Pemba, that is not enough. He recently published a letter criticising the government for its lack of action and communication.
Say who they are, show them, and act to stop the attacks. This is our request, that the authorities go deep because the poor are dying.
The Islamic State group claimed 2 of the attacks that have taken place in 2019, but police and security experts doubt the veracity of these claims.
United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has called on donor countries to release funds pledged to fight Ebola. The UN chief says further delays could result in the war on Ebola being lost. Speaking in Congo's capital, Kinshasa, Guterres said the UN received only 15% of the amount needed for the rest of 2019. Over 2,000 people have died of the disease in the Democratic Republic of the Congo just over the past year. Medical teams face the challenge of containing the outbreak in heavily populated border areas. They're also hindered by mistrust in local communities and security problems. The UN chief also called upon the allied Democratic Forces fighters in the Congo to lay down their arms. He said the United Nations will reinforce its peacekeeping operations in the country. Glasgow, Scotland's biggest city, is the epicenter of a substance abuse crisis. According to the National Records of Scotland office, it saw an unprecedented 1,187 drug-related deaths just over the last year across the nation of 5.4 million people. Figures for England and Wales released last month by Britain's Office of National Statistics show drug deaths there have also reached record levels. For details, watch this report.
They're just the most visible example of a worsening drug crisis in Glasgow and across Scotland, which now has one of the highest rates of drug-related deaths in Europe. Many drug users in Glasgow, like those in this rehabilitation centre, have been using for decades. Long-term addicts' age and years of abuse are contributing to the rocketing rate of drug deaths, with 42 the average age of such victims last year. The local government is forming a task force and opening a new drug treatment centre. But local activists say that their response hasn't really evolved in almost 30 years. Anne-Marie, herself a former addict, says it will take a drastic approach to tackle such an endemic problem.
I think the normalisation of addiction passing as culture in Scotland has a lot to do with the state we see ourselves in now.
Official statistics for last year show a record 1,187 fatalities in Scotland, with many predicting that this year's figures will be even higher.
Most Asian stock markets are trading lower after the latest escalation of the trade war between the U.S. and China. Beijing has complained to the World Trade Organization about punitive U.S. tariffs on a variety of Chinese goods. Beijing has retaliated with tariffs on American crude oil. Benchmark indices in Hong Kong, Shanghai, Seoul, and Sydney are fractionally down. Tokyo's Nikkei 225 index is marginally higher. Asian investors are awaiting an interest rate decision by the Australian Central Bank. Time now to find out what the weather is like around the world. And with that, you're all caught up. Thank you for watching this news bulletin here at Indus News.